Hello everyone, I'm Crime Whisper. I know many of you like listening to these stories as you drift off to sleep. So before you do, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you enjoy these late night mysteries, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, get comfortable, relax, and let's step quietly into tonight's chilling case. It was a quiet morning in the southwestern part of Nanjing City. An elderly man was cleaning up trash behind a fast food restaurant when he noticed a strange-looking plastic bag, thinking it might just be food waste. He opened it only to freeze in horror. Inside were chunks of meat with a strange texture and unnatural color. Alarmed, he immediately called the police. Officers arrived quickly and collected the suspicious remains for testing. The results were shocking. This wasn't animal meat. It was human, given the brutality of the discovery. The Nanjing City Police activated a special, rapid response unit. Investigators combed through trash bins, food suppliers, and even the drainage system behind the restaurant. As they expanded their search through nearby alleys and the night market, they stumbled upon several more garbage bags. Inside were dismembered human remains, mixed with food waste soft tissue, organs, fingers, even female genitalia, chopped into tiny pieces. Some parts had been deep fried, coated with ketchup, and smelled of rancid oil. Others showed signs of having been frozen before being cooked. Forensic experts determined all the remains belonged to one person, a young woman around 20 years old, about 5 feet 5 inches tall, slender, and petite. The uneven cut marks suggested the killer had used both a knife and a saw, with poor skill. But when investigators tried to match the DNA, they hit a wall. No one matching her description had been reported missing in Nanjing in recent years. They checked over 60 missing women's cases from the past 3 years and expanded their search to Shanghai and Anhui, but found nothing. It seemed the victim might have been living off the grid, disconnected from family or society. Police searched karaoke bars, labor agencies, and shelters for runaway youth. But every lead went cold. The only hope was to find the killer. The food district was filled with surveillance cameras, but also heavy foot traffic. Reviewing the footage frame by frame, investigators finally spotted something: a man in a black raincoat, face mask, and hat, often appearing between 2 and 4 a.m., lurking just outside camera range. He carried plastic bags and avoided the cameras with precision. The footage was too blurry for facial recognition, but analysts noticed key details. He was about 5 feet 7, left-handed, brisk in movement, with a slight hunch. Then came a breakthrough: a single fingerprint, faint and smeared with sweat, found inside one of the plastic bags. Unfortunately, when cross-referenced with the entire Gyeongsu province database, there was no match. The suspect had no prior record. Next, forensic teams studied the tissue and discovered the body had been frozen, thawed, and later a regular refrigerator couldn't have done this. The killer likely used a commercial-grade freezer. Police began tracing industrial freezer sales across name, but with thousands sold monthly, most paid in cash or without verified IDs. The task was overwhelming. Weeks turned into months, and months into years. The investigation stalled with no name, no motive, and no suspectant till a surprise breakthrough came 2 years later. On July 20th, 2014, in Yencheng City, an elderly couple filed a missing person report for their daughter, Ching Su, age 21. She had moved to Nanjing after high school. In search of work, she was tall, bright, and outwardly cheerful, fiercely independent, too, not wanting to be a burden on her parents. Ching worked whatever she could, waiting tables, manning a supermarket register, then at a fast food counter, but Nanjing's cost of living soon outstripped her earnings. Desperate for cash, she took a night shift pouring beer at a bar that catered to men, telling her family she'd found a job in an upscale restaurant. The extra money changed her outward life. designer bags, nicer clothes, and she began carrying large amounts of cash, but it also pulled her farther away from home. By mid-2014, her parents finally learned something was wrong when tax officials notified them that rent for their daughter's apartment had gone unpaid for nearly 2 years. Their calls went unanswered. Her phone had been disconnected. When they opened her apartment, it was clearly abandoned. In a desk drawer, her mother found a bank book in Ching Ching's name with about $13,000, sitting untouched for more than 2 years. Only then did they realize she'd truly disappeared, and they filed a missing person report. That report sent investigators back through cold cases. The 2012 Food District dismemberment, the one with body parts found in rubbish. BINs fit the timeline and profile. DNA testing confirmed the worst. The victim was Ching Ching Su. Police turned their attention to people close to her life. A colleague from the bar said Ching Ching had been fearful of her live-in boyfriend, who often lost his temper. That man Xiao worked at a state transport company. He was 31, married, and had a daughter. Records showed he'd been in contact with Ching Ching through August 2012, when officers brought him in. He offered no resistance but refused to speak. A fingerprint taken from a plastic bag, recovered at the food district scene, however, matched his print exactly. Once confronted, Zhao's composure crumbled, and he began to confess. He had a stable job and a family, but an affair with Ching Ching had spiraled into something far darker. He'd lavished her with money and an apartment. She'd come to expect more and threatened to expose the relationship when he refused to leave his wife, after weeks of pressure. One morning in August 2012, Ching Ching called saying she'd injured her ankle and needed help. Xiao went to her apartment. What began as a tense conversation turned violent. In a sudden, deadly struggle, he strangled her. Shock and panic followed. Rather than turn himself in, Xiao began making cold, calculated choices. He used his connections to buy heavy equipment, a large commercial freezer, a bone saw, dissection knives, and heavy plastic wrap. Over the following days, he dismembered the body, working methodically, cutting portions down, wrapping sections, and storing them in the freezer. Periodically, he took smaller packages out, further reduced them, and prepared them for disposal. He then transported the wrapped bundles to the food district and discarded them among restaurant refuse and market waste, where they were later discovered. When investigators arrested him and pieced together the sequence, the missing woman, the unexplained bank book, the fingerprint, the purchases, in his confession, the case that had gone cold for years finally had its answer. The entire gruesome process took nearly 2 weeks, carried out with the precision of someone calmly following a checklist. Once Zhao had finished dismembering the body, a new challenge emerged: how to dispose of the remains without drawing attention. After a few moments of thought, he devised a horrifying plan. He coated the flesh in batter, deep-fried it to resemble chicken nuggets, and topped it with ketchup to make it look like discarded fast food. But not every part could be disguised so easily. The head, for instance, was impossible to fry or conceal. To deal with it, Xiao hid it in a friend's safe, partly to keep it out of sight, and partly as an insurance policy, in case he ever needed someone to take the blame. Over the following mornings, Xiao quietly disposed of the pieces little by little, blending them with restaurant garbage across the city. Once the remains were gone, he sold the freezer on a second-hand marketplace and meticulously scrubbed the apartment, erasing every trace of what he'd done. Because Ching Ching rarely contacted her family, Xiao felt confident the crime would remain undiscovered. He slipped seamlessly back into his daily life, showing up at work on time, smiling at his colleagues, and returning home to his wife and daughter, living as though nothing had happened. For over a year, no one suspected a thing. Then, one morning, police surrounded his home and took him into custody. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. Within hours, The story exploded across national headlines under a name that would horrify the entire country: the Chicken McNugget Corpse Case. The grotesque method of disposal drew comparisons to McDonald's nuggets, turning the case into a nationwide scandal. Outrage spread across China, with many vowing never to eat street food again. The once bustling food district where the remains were found became a ghost town overnight. Vendors went entire days without a single sale, some even posting signs declaring their food 100% safe and unrelated to the case. In March 2015, the first trial began. Throughout the proceedings, Xiao sat silently, head bowed, never looking at his lawyer or the judge. His defense team claimed the killing was the result of a psychological breakdown, that he'd been blackmailed and emotionally cornered by Ching and had acted out of panic rather than intent. They argued the dismemberment and disposal were acts of fear, not premeditation. But prosecutors dismantled that narrative with precision. They pointed out that Xiao had deliberately purchased a commercial freezer, dismembered the body over several days, fried the pieces, and systematically disposed of them. These actions, they argued, were calculated, not impulsive. The court agreed. Xiao was convicted of premeditated murder and desecration of a human body and sentenced to death. Although her identity wasn't officially confirmed at the time of trial, DNA results later verified that the victim was indeed Ching Su. Her parents eventually recovered what few remains could be identified and laid her to rest in a public cemetery in their hometown. However, public opinion turned sharply against them. Many criticized the parents for waiting nearly 2 years to report their daughter missing, accusing them of neglect. Some argued the case might have been solved far sooner if they had acted earlier. Under the weight of that scrutiny, the Su family continued to live in grief and guilt, burdened by a tragedy they could never undo. While the Nanjing McNugget case was still sending shockwaves across China, on March 15, 2013, Hong Kong police conducted a sudden raid on an apartment building in Tai Kok Sui. The moment officers forced open the door, they were met with a strange mix of strong disinfectant and a metallic, blood-like odor. Oddly enough, the apartment itself was spotless, tidy, organized, almost unnaturally so. The raid stemmed from a missing persons report filed a week earlier, on March 7th, concerning Glory Chow Winky, 65, and his wife Moon Shuye, 63. The couple lived not far from the apartment, now under investigation. The report had been filed by their 2 sons, Chow Hoying and Henry Chow Halung, who told police they had last spoken to their parents on March 2nd, 5 days before finally alerting authorities. That delay immediately raised suspicions. The sons explained that their parents had mentioned plans to visit mainland China, and when they lost contact, they assumed the couple had simply left earlier than expected. But when a week passed with no calls, no messages, and no travel confirmations, they grew uneasy. Police began investigating the disappearance as potentially serious. Meanwhile, the brothers launched their own public campaign, contacting news outlets and creating a Facebook page with photos of their parents, urging anyone with information to come forward. Then, on March 12th, came a crucial update. Authorities confirmed that the couple had never left Hong Kong. Their phones, bank cards, and all digital activity had gone completely silent since the day they vanished. Surveillance footage across the city showed no sign of their movements. What began as a missing persons case was now something far darker. The elderly couple had seemingly vanished into thin air, and investigators had no idea why. Both Glory Chow Winky and Moon Shuye, neatly wrapped in plastic. Inside several food containers, they discovered roasted skin fragments and pieces of human flesh seasoned with salt and spices. What should have been a simple refrigerator became one of the most horrifying crime scenes in Hong Kong's history. The air inside the apartment was thick with disinfectant, yet beneath it lingered the unmistakable stench of decay. Investigators methodically opened each plastic box and bag, revealing what appeared at first glance to be ordinary home-cooked meals, till they noticed fingernails, strands of hair, and unmistakable human tissue. When confronted with the discovery, Henry remained calm, his tone disturbingly casual. He admitted that the bodies belonged to his parents and that he alone had planned the murders. His friend Angus, sitting beside him, trembled but did not deny his role. Henry explained that, after killing his parents, he felt a strange sense of relief, as though a lifelong burden had finally been lifted. According to forensic investigators, the killings had taken place exactly as Henry described. The couple had been ambushed the moment they entered their son's apartment. After striking them down, Henry and Angus spent hours dismembering the bodies using kitchen knives and a small saw. They took breaks only to eat or smoke, then returned to the grisly task until dawn. The pair later transported the remains to the beach under the cover of darkness, scattering bones in the sand and tossing garbage bags into the sea. What couldn't be removed was roasted, seasoned, and sealed in lunch containers to look like takeout food. The dismemberment, cooking, and cleaning took nearly a week, 5 days of unbroken horror behind closed doors. The media would soon dub it the Thai cock, suey human flesh case. News of the crime sent shockwaves across Hong Kong. Residents who lived nearby refused to return to the building. Some swore they could still smell something foul in the hallways, while others left flowers outside in silent mourning for the murdered couple. During the trial, Henry showed no remorse. He smiled when prosecutors presented the photos of his parents' remains and even corrected minor details in the timeline, as if proud of his precision. Psychiatrists later diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder and severe narcissistic tendencies, describing him as someone completely detached from empathy or moral consequence. Angus, in contrast, broke down during the proceedings. He wept uncontrollably when confronted with the evidence and told the court that he had been manipulated by Henry, who had convinced him that killing the source of pain would free them both. In 2015, the High Court sentenced Henry Chow to life imprisonment without parole, calling his crimes a deliberate, planned, and unimaginably cruel act against the very people who gave him life. Angus, citing diminished mental capacity, received a 21-year sentence. To this day, the Tai Kok Sui apartment remains vacant. No tenant has stayed for more than a few days before leaving, citing nightmares, strange smells, or hearing faint piano notes in the middle of the night. Notes that locals now whisper might be Henry's final message to the parents. He once blamed for everything. He was known among colleagues as quiet, intelligent, and deeply analytical, the kind of man who spent hours lost in thought rather than conversation. When Adam met Chen Chung at an academic conference in 2013, they quickly bonded over their shared passion for literature, design, and education. Friends described their early relationship as perfectly balanced. She was warm and ambitious, while he was calm and thoughtful. After a few years of dating, the couple married and settled in Melbourne, eventually welcoming 2 children. To outsiders, they were the image of success, a well-educated, loving family with stable careers and a comfortable home. But behind the facade of harmony, tension was quietly building. According to friends, Adam's temperament began changing around 2020. He grew distant, irritable, and withdrawn, often locking himself in his study for hours. Colleagues noticed he'd become overly defensive during meetings, snapping at minor criticism. At home, arguments between him and Chen became increasingly frequent, mostly over parenting, finances, and Adam's growing sense of inadequacy. While Chen's career flourished at a top product design firm, Adam's academic progress began to stall. Research grants fell through, student complaints piled up, and he privately confessed to a colleague that he felt overshadowed by his wife's success. The tension escalated further during the COVID lockdowns, when both were forced to work from home. Friends later testified that Chen had confided to them about Adam's controlling behavior, that he was monitoring her phone, checking her emails, and accusing her of being unfaithful without evidence. Despite the growing strain, Chen refused to leave the marriage, hoping to protect her children and believing Adam's stress was temporary. But in the months leading up to April 2022, she reportedly began planning to separate, even consulting a lawyer and looking for a new apartment. That decision, investigators later concluded, triggered the fatal confrontation. On the night of April 30th, 2022, neighbors reported hearing a heated argument between the couple shortly before 10 p.m. One witness recalled Adam shouting, "You're not taking my kids." Moments later came the scream that tore through the neighborhood. Forensic analysis later reconstructed the horrifying sequence of events. During the altercation, Adam grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed Chen multiple times in the chest and neck. She tried to flee through the front door, but he had locked it from inside. As she ran toward the backyard, Adam followed, tackling her on the lawn, where he continued the assault until she collapsed. By the time police arrived, Chen was already unresponsive. Adam stood near her body, covered in blood, muttering, "She attacked me first." At the police station, he maintained that his wife had lunged at him during an argument and that he acted in self. But investigators quickly dismantled the claim. Chen's injuries were consistent with a prolonged, frenzied attack, not a defensive struggle. Moreover, her fingernails contained traces of Adam's skin, proof she had fought desperately for her life. The trial began in April 2023, drawing massive public attention both in Australia and China. Prosecutors painted Adam as a man consumed by envy and rage, unable to tolerate his wife's independence. His defense team argued he had suffered a temporary loss of control due to psychological distress. Chen's friends and colleagues described her as bright, gentle, and endlessly patient, a woman who had spent years trying to hold her family together. Her death became a rallying cry across Australia, reigniting discussions about domestic violence and coercive control. In August 2023, after a 4-week trial, the jury found Adam Brown guilty of murder. The judge condemned his actions as a devastating betrayal of trust, driven by pride and possessiveness. Adam was sentenced to 26 years in prison, with a minimum non-parole period of 19 years. Following the verdict, Chen's family in China released a statement. She crossed oceans for love and knowledge. She should have found safety, not fear. We will raise her children to know the strength she carried until her final breath. Today, the Patrick Avenue home remains silent, its cheerful facade concealing the memory of a tragedy that shook 2 nations. For neighbors who still live nearby, the night of April 30th is one they'll never forget. The sound of a mother's voice crying for help that came too late. Each time she faced those looks and gestures, her courage slowly eroded. The once confident and spirited woman who had crossed oceans for love now found herself walking on eggshells in her own home. What began as heated words soon turned into a quiet kind of fear, the kind that settles in a house where anger lives just beneath the surface. Despite the tension, Chen tried to preserve the peace. She avoided confrontation, spoke softly, and tried to understand Adam's emotions, convincing herself that his temper came from stress or exhaustion. But deep down, she knew something fundamental had changed in the man she once admired. The kind, humorous lecturer who had captivated her years ago was now distant and unpredictable. Adam's frustration only grew as he became more withdrawn from his career and increasingly dependent on Chen for emotional support. When she failed to meet his expectations, or when she simply disagreed, his reactions became sharper, his tone colder. Friends later said they noticed a shift in Adam's behavior. He stopped attending social gatherings, rarely smiled, and spoke of his wife with subtle resentment, calling her too ambitious for her own good. At work, colleagues saw flashes of his irritability, A student once recalled that after asking a minor question, Adam snapped, "If you listened properly, you'd already know the answer." It was unlike the patient teacher everyone once admired. At home, Chen began to feel trapped. The walls of their once bright and loving home now echoed with tension. Even small disagreements about money, schedules, or childcare could ignite his anger. She began staying late at work, using urgent projects as an excuse to avoid the inevitable evening arguments. The breaking point came one evening when Chen, exhausted from a late shift, returned home to find Adam pacing the living room. Their son, who had cried at daycare that morning, was asleep upstairs. Adam confronted her the moment she walked through the door, accusing her of abandoning the family. When she tried to explain, he shouted over her, demanding to know why her career mattered more than their children. That night, the emotional distance between them became an unbridgeable gulf. From that moment on, Chen stopped trying to reason with him. Instead, she quietly began preparing for the inevitable, an escape. Friends noticed subtle changes. She started researching rental apartments, spoke discreetly to a lawyer about custody arrangements, and began saving money in a separate account, though she didn't say it outright. Those closest to her understood she was planning to leave Adam, not out of anger, but out of fear. Yet, even as she prepared for freedom, Adam sensed her growing detachment, and for a man whose world revolved around control, that realization was unbearable. The tension built like a storm waiting to break, until, finally, on the night of April 30th, 2022, the facade of a perfect academic couple shattered forever was grounded in both justice and compassion, though it offered little solace for those whose lives were shattered by the tragedy. In the judge's final remarks, he stated that Adam Brown's crime was a deliberate and sustained act of violence, one that could never be excused by emotional distress or personal hardship. While acknowledging that Adam had previously lived an exemplary life as a respected academic and father, the court made it clear that no amount of professional achievement or public admiration could outweigh the horror of what he had done. The courtroom remained silent as the sentence was read. Adam stood motionless, his head bowed, tears streaming down his face. Once a man admired for his intelligence and charm, he now faced decades behind bars, defined not by his accomplishments, but by his unforgivable act. For Chun Cheng's family, the verdict brought only a fragile sense of closure. Her mother, appearing once more via video link, expressed gratitude to the court, but said no punishment could ever bring her daughter back or heal the wounds left behind. "My daughter's life was full of light and promise," she said, voice trembling. "Now that light is gone forever." In the months following the trial, Deakin University quietly removed Adam's name from its faculty listings and academic publications. His once brilliant career, once celebrated by colleagues and students alike, ended in disgrace. Many who had known him struggled to reconcile the kind, witty lecturer, they remembered, with the man convicted of such horrific violence. As for the couple's two young children, they were placed under the care of relatives, growing up with only fading memories of their parents. Their lives, like the families on both sides, were permanently altered, victims of a tragedy born not in a single moment, but from years of unresolved conflict and growing darkness behind closed doors. The case of Adam Brown and Chen Cheng would go on to spark national debate in Australia about domestic violence and emotional control, particularly among highly educated professionals, a chilling reminder that no social class or intellect can shield one from the consequences of unchecked anger and psychological decline. In the end, what began as a story of cross-cultural love and shared dreams ended as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how fragile human relationships can be when trust, respect, and empathy are replaced by resentment and control. Her future husband, Sona, merely nodded politely, her expression unreadable. To Raja's mother, The girl's reserved manner seemed like shyness, not disinterest. She reassured her son that everything would change once they were married, that Sonam simply needed time to adjust. On May 11, 2025, their grand wedding took place in Mumbai, attended by hundreds of guests from both influential families. The celebration was magnificent. Music, dance, and tradition intertwined beautifully. Yet, amid all the festivity, those closest to Raja couldn't help noticing that his bride remained unusually withdrawn. She smiled only when prompted, avoided conversation, and barely looked at her husband throughout the ceremony. Still, Raja brushed it off, convincing himself that she was simply overwhelmed by the occasion. After the wedding, the newlyweds set off for their honeymoon in Munnar, a hill station in Kerala, famous for its misty mountains and lush tea gardens. Raja saw it as a fresh start, a chance to finally connect with his wife away from family expectations and cultural pressures. He had even planned romantic surprises, candlelight dinners, sightseeing, and a scenic hike along the cliffs of Misapulamala. But from the very beginning, things felt off. Sonam remained distant and cold, spending most of her time on her phone. She often stepped away to take calls in private, giving vague answers when Raja asked who she was talking to. "Just my cousin," she'd reply curtly, changing the topic each time. Raja tried to be patient, hoping her attitude would soften over time. Little did he know, those phone calls, later revealed to be over 230 in total, would become key evidence in a shocking chain of events. On May 23rd, 12 days after their wedding, the couple set out early for a mountain trek, one of the final activities before heading home. They were seen together by several tourists along the trail, laughing and taking photos. But by evening, only one of them would make it down alive. At around 6:30 p.m., a loud scream echoed through the valley. Locals rushed toward the sound and discovered Raja's lifeless body at the bottom of a 900-meter cliff. His skull was fractured, ribs shattered, and his watch smashed. Near the cliff's edge lay a single blood-stained jacket belonging to Sonam. She, however, was nowhere to be found. The initial assumption was that the couple had met with a tragic accident, but as police began investigating, inconsistencies emerged. Raja's injuries suggested he had been pushed with great force, not that he had slipped. Furthermore, CCTV footage from a roadside shop near the trail captured 3 unidentified men following the couple earlier that day. When investigators checked Sonam's phone records, they made a startling discovery. Every one of her hundreds of calls before the incident had been made to a single number, belonging to a man named Arjun Patel. Arjun, a 26-year-old gym trainer from Delhi, had a prior criminal record for fraud and extortion. What connection could he possibly have with the bride of a wealthy businessman? Friends later told police that Sonam had met Arjun through social media months before her engagement. Their relationship had grown intense, though she never revealed it to her family. When her marriage to Raja was arranged, she had reportedly begged Arjun to stop her parents, but he told her to go through with it, promising that once she was married, they would find a way to get rid of her husband and claim his wealth. What began as a traditional marriage between 2 affluent families now appeared to be the front for a chilling plot of greed and betrayal. The police launched a full-scale manhunt to find Sonam and the 3 men spotted near the scene. What they uncovered next would shock the nation, a web of deceit, obsession, and premeditated violence that blurred the line between love and manipulation. Identification difficult at first glance. However, when officers examined the wrist, they found a distinctive luxury watch, the same one Raja had been wearing in his last video call to his mother. The confirmation was devastating. Raja Raghuvanshi, just 30 years old and only 12 days into his marriage, was dead. His body bore catastrophic injuries, multiple fractures, deep head trauma, and torn clothing consistent with a violent fall. But the discovery of Raja's body only deepened the mystery, because Sonam was nowhere to be found. There was no trace of her, no footprints, no belongings, not even a phone signal. The only clue near the cliff's edge was a blood-stained jacket, later confirmed to be hers. At first, police considered the possibility that both had fallen together and Sonam's body had been carried off by the current or into denser jungle terrain. Yet, doubts began to grow once forensic experts examined the scene more closely. According to investigators, the steepness of the ravine and the positioning of Raj's injuries suggested he hadn't simply slipped. He had been pushed, and with great force. Moreover, locals living near the trail reported hearing raised voices, possibly a quarrel. Shortly before the fatal scream echoed through the valley, the turning point came when detectives traced Sonam's phone activity. Records showed that before and during the honeymoon, she had made over 230 calls, all to the same man. His name, Arjun Patel, a 26-year-old gym instructor from Delhi, with a history of fraud and violent assault. Police quickly learned that Arjun and Sonam had been in a secret relationship for nearly a year before her arranged marriage to Raja. Despite being from vastly different backgrounds, their relationship was intense, even obsessive. When Sonam's family arranged her marriage to Raja, she reportedly pleaded with Arjun to intervene, but he allegedly told her to go through with it, that once she married, they would find a way to remove Raja from the picture permanently. Sonam's family, unaware of this relationship, believed she had accepted her role as a dutiful wife. But behind the facade, investigators discovered a chilling plan. Phone records, travel data, and CCTV footage revealed that Arjun had traveled to Assam just days before the couple arrived. Even more suspiciously, footage from a roadside cafe near Cherrapunji showed 3 men on motorbikes tailing Raja and Sonam's rented scooter shortly before their disappearance. As the investigation intensified, Sonam's disappearance began to look less like a tragedy and more like a vanishing act. Interpol alerts were issued across India's northeastern borders in case she attempted to flee the country. Police publicly announced that she was the prime suspect in Raja's murder, believed to have conspired with Arjun and his associates to kill her husband and staged the scene as an accident. Days later, another chilling piece of evidence surfaced. Forensic teams examining Raja's recovered phone found that moments before his death, his camera had automatically captured a burst of blurred images, possibly during the struggle. One of those images showed a faint silhouette of a woman standing several feet behind him, right at the cliff's edge, with the country gripped by the case. Media outlets dubbed it the honeymoon cliff murder. Public outrage soared, not only over the crime itself, but over the cold-blooded betrayal at its core. As search operations continued across Assam and Meghalaya, investigators vowed to uncover the full truth, whether Sonam was on the run, in hiding, or perhaps had also become a victim of the same men she might have trusted. The story that began as a fairy tale wedding had transformed into one of India's most shocking modern tragedies, a tale of love, deceit, and murder amid the misty cliffs of Cherrapunji, accompanied by a young man matching Raja's description. The witness recalled that Sonam appeared relaxed, not distressed or injured, and was carrying a small handbag. She overheard Sonam speaking quietly to the man in Hindi, saying, "We'll stay low for a few days, then figure out the next move." The woman didn't think much of it at the time, until she later saw Sonam's photo on television and recognized her as the missing bride from the national headlines. She immediately contacted police to report what she'd seen. This statement turned the entire case on its head. Investigators began cross-checking Sonam's claim of being abducted and unconscious with CCTV footage from train stations across northern India. To their astonishment, footage from May 30th showed Sonam and Raj boarding a train together at Guwahati railway station just a week after Raj's death. Both were seen carrying light luggage and wearing masks, behaving calmly and purposefully. As evidence mounted, police confronted Sonam with the footage. Under pressure, her story began to fall apart. She first denied knowing Raj, claiming he was just a friend helping her escape. But digital forensics told a different story. Hundreds of calls, shared live locations, deleted chats recovered from cloud backups, and even online purchases made under Raj's name for flight and hotel bookings. Finally, on June 11, 2025, Sonam broke down during interrogation and confessed. Her confession revealed a cold and calculated plan that had been in motion for months. She admitted that she never wanted to marry Raja, but her parents forced her to. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, she and Raj plotted to kill Raja so they could be together and claim his life insurance payout. According to her statement, Raj recruited his friends Vishal, Akos, and Anand to help with the plan, promising them a share of the stolen jewelry. On May 23rd, after trekking down to the route bridge, the group ambushed Raja during the climb back up. While Sonam distracted him by pretending to check her phone, the three men attacked. Raja tried to fight back, but he was overpowered, beaten, and stabbed multiple times. After ensuring he was dead, they threw his body into the ravine, wiped the area for prints, and fled. Sonam claimed she had been forced to help out of fear, but investigators didn't believe her. Her calm demeanor after the crime, her deliberate travel with Raj across several states, and the planted evidence, including her jacket, all suggested she was an active participant. All five suspects, Sonam, Raj, Fish, and Anand, were charged with murder, criminal conspiracy, and destruction of evidence. When the case went to court, it captured the entire nation's attention. The shocking betrayal, the honeymoon setting, and the chilling level of planning turned it into one of the most talked about cases of 2025. During her trial, Sonam remained largely emotionless, showing little remorse. Raja's family, devastated and furious, attended every hearing. His mother told reporters outside the courtroom, "My son went on a honeymoon. He never came back. She didn't just kill him, she killed our whole family's peace." In August 2026, after a year-long trial filled with forensic evidence, witness testimonies, and Sonam's own confession, the court found her and Raj guilty of murder. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment. Vishal, Akos, and Anand received 20-year sentences for assisting in the crime. The judge, in his final remarks, called it a murder born from obsession and deceit, emphasizing how greed and rebellion had destroyed 5 lives and shattered 2 families. In the end, the story of Raja and Sonam, which began as a wedding full of promise, became one of India's most haunting cautionary tales about love turned lethal. After that, Sonam was seen accompanied by 2 young men, whose faces were also wrapped in cloth. She approached the woman and asked which bus went to Guz. After getting directions, Sonam and her companions boarded the same bus about 10 minutes later. The woman took a window seat while Sonam sat beside her and asked for some water to wash her face. That's when the woman caught a clear glimpse of Sonam's face. An hour and a half later, the woman got off the bus midway, while Sonam continued the journey. The next morning, when news broke about Sonam's dramatic reappearance and her claim of being attacked and abducted, the woman immediately contacted police to expose the lie. Following this, Sonam was taken to a local government facility for medical examination. Meanwhile, authorities from Meghalaya and Madhya Pradesh coordinated efforts, leading to the arrest of the 4th suspect Anand in Madhya Pradesh. With that, all 4 key individuals, Raj and his 3 accomplices, were now in custody. Later that same evening, Sonam herself was formally detained. On June 9, 2025, the Meghalaya State Police held their first official press conference, confirming what many had begun to suspect. Raja's death was not a random act of violence, but a premeditated murder plotted by his own wife, Sonam, and her boyfriend, Raj. According to investigators, the couple had hired 3 hitmen, all close friends of Raj, to carry out the killing. Sonam's father publicly dismissed these claims, accusing the Meghalaya police of fabricating the entire story. to protect the state's tourism image. However, officials responded swiftly, stating that all 5 suspects had confessed during interrogation and were taken back to the crime scene for a full reconstruction. Sonam's own brother later told the media he was completely certain his sister was the true mastermind, adding that their family had decided to sever all ties with her. According to official reports, Sonam and Raj began plotting Raj's murder shortly after her wedding. Raj paid the hired killers 2 million rupees to execute the plan. The initial attempt was meant to take place at the Kamasha temple in Guwahati, but several failed efforts followed due to the attackers' lack of experience. On the morning of May 23, 2025, Raja and Sonam headed toward the remote and isolated area of Krangsuri Falls, a place with no surveillance, sparse traffic, and surrounded by dense forest, making it ideal for an ambush. Around 9:45 a.m., a travel blogger's camera unintentionally captured Raja and Sonam walking together, and just 20 minutes earlier, the same camera had recorded the 3 killers nearby, waiting. By 10 a.m., witnesses saw Raja and Sonam chatting casually with the men, who had pretended to be tourists from Delhi to gain their trust. During a detailed reenactment conducted on June 17, 2025, all suspects admitted their involvement. They explained how the plan to kill Raja initially failed in the parking area, forcing them to follow the couple to the Krangsuri viewpoint instead. There, while Raja was admiring the scenery, one attacker struck him from behind with a heavy object. As he collapsed, Sonam reportedly gave the order to finish the job. 2 knives were used in the brutal attack, both later recovered by police. After Raja's death, Sonam removed his jewelry and distributed it among the killers. His phone was smashed and thrown into the ravine to destroy evidence, and his body was dumped over the edge to confuse investigators. The group moved Raja's scooter nearly 20 kilometers away to misdirect the search. Police later learned that the killers had purchased new SIM cards upon arriving in used them for a few days, then discarded them immediately after the murder to avoid being tracked. Following the killing, the group split up. Sonam took a taxi to Guwahati, then boarded a train to Delhi, hiding in an apartment she and Raj had secretly rented beforehand, according to police. Their next step was even more horrifying. They planned to fake Sonam's death by killing another woman, burning her body, and claiming it was Sonam, allowing her to vanish without suspicion. But when one of the accomplices was arrested, Raj panicked and told Sonam to flee to her hometown, fabricate a kidnapping story. And by time, on June 22, 2025, another suspect, Shivam, a real estate agent, was arrested. He had reportedly moved and burned a suitcase belonging to Sonam that contained cash, jewelry, and a handgun originally meant to kill Raja. Days later, on June 23rd, police also arrested Balvi, the security guard of the rented apartment, for his suspected role in helping the couple hide after the crime. Due to the sheer brutality and complexity of the case, which went far beyond a typical homicide, the investigation remains ongoing. Authorities are still piecing together several missing details, if proceedings stay on schedule. Formal charges against all suspects are expected to be filed by September 2025. Her own 2 hands. Leaving now would mean abandoning everything she had worked for. But her decision to stay would soon lead to a nightmare as the war intensified. The clinic's business slowed and money became scarce. Priya's partner, Marty, began acting differently. He started visiting the clinic at odd hours, interfering with her work and making unwelcome advances. At first, Priya brushed it off, thinking it was just stress from the chaos around them. But soon, the harassment escalated. According to Priya's later testimony, Marty began to control her life, threatening to cancel the clinic's license if she didn't comply with his demands. Without a local sponsor, her entire business and her legal right to live in Yemen depended on him. Desperate and terrified, Priya endured months of abuse, both physical and emotional. She couldn't report him to the police, knowing that a foreign woman accusing a Yemeni man would never be believed, and could even get her arrested. Back home, Thomas noticed changes in her tone during their phone calls. She sounded anxious, distant, sometimes breaking down mid-conversation. She told him vaguely that things weren't going well, but never revealed the full extent of what she was going through. By early 2017, Priya's life had spiraled into misery. Marty had allegedly taken full control of her finances, locked her passport away, and even limited her movement outside the clinic. She was trapped in a foreign country, isolated and terrified. Then one day, something inside her broke. In July 2017, Priya confided in a close friend and fellow nurse, revealing everything: the abuse, the blackmail, and her growing desperation to escape. Together, they came up with a plan. They would drug Marty, take back her documents, and flee to the Indian embassy for protection. On July 24, 2017, Priya invited Marty to the clinic under the pretense of a business discussion. Her friend was also present, hiding in another room. Priya prepared Marty's drink with sedatives, hoping he would fall unconscious long enough for her to recover her passport and escape. But the dose was too high. Within minutes, Marty began to convulse. Priya panicked. What happened next remains murky. Even years later, Priya claimed she tried to revive him, but failed. In fear and shock, she called her friend for help. The two women decided to hide the body, terrified of what the Yemeni authorities might do to them if they discovered a local man dead in a foreign woman's clinic. They dismembered his body and hid the remains in water tanks on the building's roof, hoping it would never be found. But within a day, the stench drew attention, and the gruesome discovery was made. Police arrived, and Priya was immediately arrested. Despite claiming that Marty's death had been an accident, the brutality of the crime shocked even the investigators. Under Yemen's strict Sharia law, she was charged with premeditated murder, a crime punishable by death. The case quickly made headlines in both Yemen and India. In India, her husband Thomas was left devastated. He couldn't comprehend how the gentle, soft-spoken woman he married could be accused of such a horrific act. When he tried contacting her, he learned that she was being held in a Yemeni prison with almost no access to legal aid or translators. Over the next few years, as Priya languished in prison, activists and Indian diplomats began fighting for her release. They argued that she had been the victim of sexual violence and coercion, and that the killing was not premeditated but a tragic accident born out of fear. International human rights groups took notice, calling it a case of self-defense gone wrong. By 2021, thousands of people had signed petitions, urging the Indian government to intervene and negotiate her release under Yemen's blood money system, a law allowing a death sentence to be lifted if compensation was paid to the victims. Family. Thomas himself traveled from Kerala to Delhi, meeting officials and pleading for help. He became the face of a growing movement, saying, "She's not a murderer. She's a victim who tried to survive." Years passed, and Priya's fate hung in the balance. In 2024, a Yemeni court confirmed her death sentence, but the Indian community in Yemen continued to raise funds to pay the blood money. By 2025, negotiations were still ongoing, and hope remained that she might one day be freed. The story of Nimisha Priya became a haunting example of how poverty, patriarchy, and foreign law can trap a woman in a nightmare far from home. A tragedy where survival itself became a crime. By 2025, Nimisha Priya's case had become a national movement in India. What began as a shocking headline, "Indian nurse sentenced to death in Yemen," evolved into one of the most emotional and politically sensitive international human rights efforts of the decade. After her conviction, Nimisha had spent years in a Yemeni prison under brutal conditions. She was housed with local inmates, often without access to proper food, medical care, or even communication with her family. Her only contact with the outside world came through occasional visits from Indian embassy officials and humanitarian volunteers. Back in India, her husband Thomas refused to give up. He sold his rickshaw, borrowed money, and traveled repeatedly to Delhi and Chennai to meet diplomats, lawyers, and NGOs. His goal was simple but daunting: to save his wife's life. Under Yemen's legal system, the only way to overturn a death sentence for murder is through the diya, or blood money, a payment made to the victim's family as compensation if they agree to forgive the accused. But the amount demanded was enormous. Reports suggested the victim's family sought nearly 1.5 crore, around $180,000, a figure far beyond what Thomas or his supporters could afford. Still, Thomas persisted. With the help of the Save Nimisha Priya International Action Council, a group formed by activists and nurses associations in Kerala, a fundraising campaign began. Social media flooded with the hashtag #SUF, and hundreds of Keralite nurses working abroad donated part of their salaries. In 2023, the Indian Ministry of External Affairs officially intervened, sending a delegation to Sana'a to negotiate with Yemeni authorities. But the process was painfully slow. Yemen was still torn by civil war, and many government offices barely functioned. Even identifying and contacting the victim's family proved difficult. Meanwhile, Priya's mental and physical health deteriorated in prison. Her lawyer reported that she suffered from chronic depression, nightmares, and deep guilt over what had happened. Still, she expressed remorse for her actions and begged only for one thing: to see her daughter again before she died. Her daughter, by then a teenager living in Kerala, barely remembered her mother. She had grown up under the shadow of a crime she couldn't understand, mocked by some classmates and pitied by others. Yet she continued to write letters to her mother, letters that were hand-delivered through embassy staff every few months. In 2024, the Kerala High Court took the unprecedented step of allowing Thomas and a small delegation to travel to presumed Yemen to personally meet the victim's family and seek forgiveness. The trip was risky. Yemen was still unstable, but it represented perhaps the final hope to save Priya's life. According to court documents, the delegation managed to locate Marty's relatives and plead their case. They explained Priya's suffering, the abuse she endured, and how she never intended to kill Marty. They begged for mercy, not for freedom, but for the chance to let her live. Talks reportedly showed progress. The victim's family agreed to consider pardoning her if the full diya payment could be made. By early 2025, over 1 crore had been raised through global donations. The remaining amount was still being collected when the Yemeni court issued an extension, delaying her execution pending the outcome of negotiations. As of mid-2025, Nimisha Priya remains alive, still in custody in Yemen. Her sentence has not yet been carried out, and diplomatic efforts continue to secure her release through blood, money, and pardon. Her story remains one of tragedy and endurance, a tale of how one woman's dream of a better life abroad turned into a nightmare of exploitation, violence, and survival. And yet, amid that darkness, her husband's relentless struggle has become a symbol of faith and devotion. When asked by a reporter if he still loves her after everything that happened, Thomas quietly replied, "She went abroad to build our future. She made mistakes, but she doesn't deserve to die for them. I will fight for her until my last breath." Would never be free. Every avenue of escape had been cut off. Her passport was gone, her legal identity stolen, and the man who tormented her was now her husband in the eyes of Yemeni law. Every time she tried to resist, Marty retaliated. He blackmailed her, claiming he would report her to the authorities as a prostitute, a label that under Yemen's harsh legal system could have led to her being imprisoned or even executed. For a woman alone in a war-torn country, that threat was terrifying. Priya's life became an endless cycle of fear, humiliation, and survival. She reached out to the Indian embassy multiple times for help, but the embassy was barely functioning due to the ongoing conflict. Indian citizens trapped in Yemen had little recourse, especially women without documentation. Each passing month made her situation worse. By late 2016, Priya was a shell of her former self. Once a respected nurse and business owner, she now lived in constant fear of Marty's violence. He would show up at her clinic or home, unannounced, often drunk, threatening her with a knife and demanding money. He forced her to sign documents she couldn't read, handing over full ownership of her clinic. She was trapped emotionally, physically, and legally. In December that year, she managed to contact a fellow Indian nurse, tearfully describing what had been happening. The nurse urged her to leave Yemen at any cost, even illegally. But Priya knew, without her passport or exit visa, she would be arrested at the airport. She needed to find a way to reclaim her documents first, or stop Marty before he destroyed her completely. That moment marked the beginning of her desperate plan. Over the next few months, Priya quietly gathered information about Marty's movements and habits. She kept a record of his abuse, hoping one day to prove her innocence if she survived. Friends later testified that she had spoken of wanting only to get her passport back and return home, not to kill him. Then, in July 2017, after another violent incident, she decided she couldn't take it anymore. Marty had once again beaten her and threatened to sell her if she tried to escape. With no other options left, Priya reached out to another Indian nurse named Hema, pleading for help to get her documents back. Together, the two women devised a risky plan. They would invite Marty to Priya's apartment, under the pretense of reconciliation, sedate him, and retrieve her passport and papers from his bag while he slept. But the situation spiraled out of control. According to court documents, Marty became aggressive during the confrontation. A violent struggle broke out. In the chaos, Priya injected him with a sedative meant for her clinic's patients, but she accidentally administered a lethal dose. Marty collapsed and died almost instantly. Panicked and terrified, Priya and Hema tried to hide the body. They dismembered it and placed the remains in bags, later disposing of them in the water tank of the apartment building. The next day, the horrific discovery was made, and Priya was arrested. When police found her, she was still in shock, unable to process what had happened. She immediately confessed, but insisted that she never intended to kill him. Her only goal, she said, was to recover her passport and go home to her daughter. The Yemeni court, however, saw it differently. Under their law, even an unintentional killing during an illegal act qualified as murder. In 2020, she was sentenced to death. From that point on, her story became not just a criminal case, but a human tragedy. A woman who had once gone abroad to build a better life for her family ended up trapped in a nightmare of abuse, corruption, and war, forced to defend her life in a foreign land where the law itself was stacked against her. After her arrest, Nimisha Priya was taken to a detention center in Sana. What followed was a legal ordeal unlike anything she could have imagined. She was placed in solitary confinement for days, interrogated for hours at a time without legal counsel, and made to recount the same story repeatedly until her voice went hoarse. Yemeni investigators, guided by their own cultural and legal frameworks, viewed her less as a victim of abuse and more as a dangerous foreigner who had killed a Yemeni citizen. Under Yemeni law, a foreign woman's testimony carries only half the weight of a man's, and with Marty deceased, his forged marriage certificate became her greatest curse. Legally, the court saw Marty not as her abuser, but as her husband. This meant the killing was treated as a premeditated murder of a spouse, one of the most severe crimes under Yemen's Sharia-based legal system. Throughout the trial, Priya pleaded that she never intended to kill him. She explained through translators that she had only meant to inject him with a mild sedative to make him fall asleep, so she could retrieve her passport and documents he'd stolen. She described years of physical and sexual abuse, of being trapped and powerless, but the court was unmoved. To them, a confession had already been made. She had admitted to injecting him, dismembering the body, and attempting to conceal it. That alone sealed her fate. The mitigating circumstances of abuse, the forged documents, and even the ongoing war around her carried little weight in a system built on rigid interpretation. In 2018, the Sana Criminal Court convicted her of murder and sentenced her to death by hanging. Her co-defendant, Hema, who had assisted in disposing of the body, was sentenced to life imprisonment. News of the case reached India through Yemeni media outlets, and soon after, it broke into national headlines. Kerala nurse faces death sentence in Yemen for killing abusive husband. The story shocked the nation. Public opinion was split. Some saw it as an open-end shot murder case, while others viewed her as a victim of domestic violence and patriarchal injustice trapped in a foreign system. Her husband, Thomas, still in Kerala with their daughter, was devastated. When reporters asked how he felt about his wife being accused of killing her husband in Yemen, his response was heartbreaking. That man was not her husband. I am. He destroyed her life, and now the world blames her for trying to survive. In the months that followed, Indian diplomats attempted to appeal her conviction. However, Yemen's judiciary was fractured due to the ongoing civil war, with two competing governments operating separate legal systems. This made the appeal process nearly impossible. By 2019, the Indian Ministry of External Affairs had formally taken up her case. They appointed legal counsel, provided translation support, and initiated diplomatic negotiations for clemency. Meanwhile, activists in Kerala began organizing protests and petitions under the banner #SaveNIMISHAPRIYA. Dozens of nurses' associations across India and the Middle East joined the campaign. They argued that Priya was a victim of trafficking and abuse, that her actions, while tragic, stemmed from years of systemic violence and fear. In 2021, a ray of hope appeared. Under Yemen's Kisses retribution law, families of murder victims could grant forgiveness in exchange for dire blood money compensation. If the victim's family accepted payment and issued a pardon, Priya's death sentence could be commuted. But there was a problem. The victim's family demanded a huge amount, reportedly over 1.5 crore, around $180,000. For a poor Indian family, that was an impossible sum. Still, Thomas refused to give up. He joined forces with the Save Nimisha Priya International Action Council, a network of lawyers, activists, and nurses who launched a global crowdfunding campaign. Indians abroad, especially healthcare workers in the Gulf, began donating. Bit by bit, they raised funds, hoping to save her from execution. By 2023, over 1 crore had been collected. The Kerala High Court even permitted Thomas and a small delegation to travel to Yemen, an extraordinary decision given the country's instability, to meet the victim's family and seek forgiveness directly. Negotiations were delicate. The victim's family, still grieving, initially refused, but after several rounds of talks and intervention from local mediators, they agreed to reconsider, provided the full amount was paid, and Priya expressed formal repentance. As of 2025, Nimisha Priya remains alive in custody in Yemen. Her execution has been postponed, pending the completion of the blood, money settlement, and official pardon process. Her case continues to draw international attention as a haunting example of how war, gender inequality, and legal injustice can collide to destroy an innocent life. Today, from her prison cell, Priya reportedly spends her days teaching other inmates basic nursing and hygiene, the only thing she still feels she can give. She once wrote in a letter to her daughter, "I don't know if I will ever come home, but if I don't, remember this. I tried to live with kindness, even when the world showed me no mercy." Council of Yemen upheld the death sentence once again. It was the final legal verdict. The last door in the judicial system had been shut, but even then, hope did not die. Under Yemen's Kisses law, a death sentence can be commuted if the victim's family forgives the offender in exchange for blood money. For Nimisha Priya, that became the only path left between life and death. Her mother, Vasantha Kumari, and husband, Thomas, began tirelessly appealing to both the Indian and Yemeni governments for help. They reached out to the Indian embassy in Djibouti, which handles diplomatic matters for Yemen, and to every possible human rights organization that would listen. But the war-torn state of Yemen made things unimaginably complex. The country had two governments, multiple courts, and no centralized authority capable of approving clemency quickly. Then, in 2021, a small group of activists and legal experts in Kerala formed the SAVE, Nimisha Priya International Action Council. Their mission was singular: to save her life through negotiation, compassion, and diplomacy. They began fundraising efforts, legal outreach, and international petitions. Slowly, awareness spread across India and among Indian nurses working in the Middle East. Through these efforts, the family of Marty, the victim, was finally contacted. They expressed a willingness to consider granting forgiveness, but only if the DIA amount was paid in full. The figure they demanded was around 1.5 crore rupees, an enormous sum for an ordinary Indian family. Still, the campaign continued. Crowdfunding drives were launched. Keralites working abroad in the Gulf, in Europe, in hospitals everywhere, began donating whatever they could. For them, Nimisha wasn't just one woman. She represented countless Indian nurses who leave their homes to work in dangerous, unfamiliar lands, often enduring abuse silently. By early 2023, the campaign had raised nearly 1 crore rupees. The Kerala High Court, recognizing the extraordinary situation, granted permission for Thomas and a small delegation to travel to Yemen, despite the ongoing civil war, to meet the victim's family in person. It was a rare, risky, and emotional decision in the streets of Sana'a. Amid checkpoints and the sounds of distant shelling, Thomas met Marty's relatives. Through translators and mediators, he begged them for forgiveness, not as a lawyer or diplomat, but as a husband fighting for the life of the woman he still loved. Reports suggest the meeting ended without an immediate decision, but it opened a fragile door toward mercy. As of late 2025, Nimisha Priya remains alive in prison. Her execution has been stayed as negotiations for blood money and clemency continue. Indian diplomats and humanitarian groups are still working to finalize the DIA payment and secure a formal pardon from the victim's family. Inside her cell, Nimisha has become something of a quiet legend. Fellow prisoners call her Madame Nurse. She spends her days teaching hygiene, basic first aid, and English to other inmates. In her letters to her family, she writes with a calmness that belies the nightmare she has endured. "Tell my daughter not to cry for me," one letter reads. "Even if I never come home, I want her to live without fear, the way I never could." Her story, one of love, abuse, desperation, and injustice, continues to haunt India's conscience. What began as a dream for a better life in a foreign land turned into a tragic fight for survival against cruelty, corruption, and fate itself. The Yemeni committee once again rejected Priya's final appeal. Her mother and husband pleaded for permission to travel to Yemen, but the Indian government initially denied their request, citing serious security concerns. India has no active diplomatic mission in Yemen and cannot guarantee the safety of its citizens there. The southern port city of Aden had become a fierce battleground between Houthi rebels and government forces amid an unending civil war. With India yet to officially recognize any governing authority in Yemen, traveling into the country was perilous. The only available route required flying into Aden and then enduring a treacherous 12 to 14-hour journey by road to Sana'a. After months of negotiations, in April 2024, the Indian government finally granted approval for Priya's mother, husband, and young daughter to travel to Yemen. Their mission was to meet Priya and open talks with Marty's family, seeking a potential reconciliation or settlement that might spare her life. Since her case fell under the jurisdiction of Houthi-controlled territory, it was subject to the rulings of religious courts governed by Islamic Sharia law. Under Sharia, a death sentence may sometimes be commuted if the victim's family accepts blood money diya, a financial settlement in exchange for forgiveness. It was the only legal route left for Priya to escape execution, but such mercy depended entirely on Marty's family's willingness to forgive. Reports indicated that the estimated DA in this case amounted to roughly 700,000 rupees, a sum far beyond what Priya's financially struggling family could ever afford. They wrote multiple letters pleading for financial assistance from the Kerala state government, but received no response. Her husband Thomas worked relentlessly to raise funds and managed to collect only 10,000 rupees on his own. By June 2024, the International Action Committee for Priya launched a global crowdfunding campaign to help reduce her sentence. A well-known Kerala businessman came forward, pledging 10 million rupees to support the effort. Yet a significant obstacle remained: finding someone qualified and trusted to negotiate directly with Marty's family. After much deliberation, it was decided that a professional negotiator, appointed through the Indian embassy, would lead the talks. However, before negotiations even began, the negotiator demanded $40,000 in fees, insisting on $20,000 upfront. The volunteer organization reluctantly paid the initial amount, but midway through discussions, the negotiators suddenly halted progress, demanding the remaining balance before continuing. Whether the second payment was ever made, or what became of those negotiations, remains undisclosed to this day. Then, on December 30, 2024, Yemen's president officially rejected Priya's clemency plea, ordering that her execution be carried out within a month. But in January 2025, authorities abruptly reversed course, clarifying that the president had not yet signed the final death order. Indian officials confirmed that diplomatic efforts were still ongoing to delay or overturn the execution. In mid-February 2025, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi publicly revealed that he had personally appealed for intervention. During a meeting with a senior envoy from the Houthi leadership, he also discussed the matter with India's Foreign Minister, Subrahmanyam Jaishankar, at the Indian Ocean Conference in Muscat. According to Araghchi, Houthi spokesperson Mohammed Abdul Salam had assured him they would make every effort to find a humane solution. However, on July 10, 2025, Priya informed her husband in a prison message that her execution date had been set for July 16. As the day drew near, the International Action Committee launched one final, desperate effort, dispatching a team of volunteer negotiators to meet with Marty's family directly. During these talks, they offered $1 million USD in blood money in exchange for forgiveness, and even pledged to raise the amount further if required. Yet, Marty's family has neither accepted nor rejected the offer. They have remained silent. In desperation, Priya's mother sold their family home and traveled to Yemen herself, determined to save her daughter's life. She stayed for months, pleading for an audience with Marty's relatives, but her efforts were repeatedly met with refusal. Meanwhile, Thomas remained in India, continuing to rally public support and appeal to government officials. Despite everything, the war, the silence, the bureaucracy, the family continues to hold on to faith that Priya will survive and return home. An anonymous official from India's Ministry of External Affairs confirmed that Priya's case has been under close observation since the beginning, and that relevant agencies are doing everything possible within their capacity. Several members of parliament and the governor of Kerala have also filed petitions urging the central government to intensify efforts to save her life. Suffocating, at first, Kim's concern for Minjong seemed endearing. Constant texts to check if she'd eaten, calls to make sure she'd arrived home safely. But before long, that concern turned into surveillance. He demanded to know where she was at all times, who she was with, and why she didn't reply immediately. If she was seen talking to male classmates or colleagues, Kim would explode in anger. By May 2023, friends began to notice bruises on Minjung's arms and a change in her behavior. Once cheerful and outgoing, she became anxious and withdrawn, often making excuses for Kim's behavior. When her friends urged her to leave him, she always said the same thing: "He's not bad, he just loves me too much." But Kim's jealousy only deepened when Minjang received her student visa approval for Australia in December 2023. What should have been the happiest news of her life became the turning point of her nightmare. Kim reacted violently, accusing her of abandoning him and planning to meet someone else abroad. Witnesses later told police that he had followed her to her part-time job several times, shouting at her outside the cafe in April 2024. Just 2 months before her scheduled departure, Minjung confided in a close friend that she planned to end things for good. She said she wanted to focus on her studies overseas and escape the constant fear she felt around Kim. But breaking up with a possessive man rarely ends cleanly, and in this case, it would prove fatal. On the night of June 30th, 2024, neighbors in the apartment building recalled hearing loud arguing and objects being thrown around 1:45 a.m. shortly afterward. The sound stopped, followed by an eerie silence. Then, at 2:13 a.m., the security camera captured Minjung's fall from the 12th floor window. 10 long minutes passed before Kim finally called the police. When investigators examined the apartment, they found overturned furniture, shattered glass, and signs of a violent struggle. Kim's fingerprints were discovered on the windowsill and on the victim's neck. He claimed they had been pushing and pulling during an argument and that she had fallen accidentally, but forensic analysis later found deep bruising, consistent with manual strangulation, prior to the fall. As the investigation deepened, Kim's past came to light. He had a prior record of domestic violence against a former girlfriend who had withdrawn her complaint under family pressure. Authorities now believed that pattern had repeated itself, this time with deadly consequences. In September 2024, Kim was officially charged with murder, evidence tampering, and delayed emergency reporting. During the trial, he maintained that he never intended to kill Minjang and that she had lost her balance in the middle of their argument. But the jury didn't believe him. The court cited overwhelming physical evidence and inconsistencies in his timeline, calling his actions a cold attempt to disguise murder as suicide. On December 19, 2024, the Busan District Court sentenced Kim Daewon to 35 years in prison. The judge described the case as a brutal reminder of the dangers of obsessive control disguised as love. At the sentencing, Minjung's mother wept silently, holding her daughter's passport, the one stamped with the visa that was supposed to begin her new life in Australia. "My daughter wanted to see the world," she said softly, but the world she saw was crueler than I ever imagined. The tragedy of Lee Minjang became a rallying cry across South Korea, sparking debates about dating violence, stalking laws, and the urgent need for stronger protections for women in abusive relationships. Her apartment, if she didn't agree to see him, his obsession grew darker each day. He often waited outside her building for hours, sometimes entire nights, sending messages like, "If you won't come out, I'll make sure we leave this world together." Friends who saw these messages begged Minjang to call the police again, but her trust in the system was gone. She feared that even if she reported him, it would once again end with warnings and mediation, leaving her more vulnerable than before. In May 2024, 1 month before the tragedy, Kim secretly followed Minjang to her university. He watched from afar as she laughed with her classmates and later confronted her outside the campus gates, accusing her of betraying him. Witnesses recalled the scene vividly: a young woman trying to calm a man who looked completely out of control. Campus security separated them, and Kim was escorted away. When questioned by police later, He claimed he had just been worried about her well-being, since there was no physical injury, and Ming Jiang refused to file another report. The case was dismissed once again. By late June, Ming Jiang was counting down the days to her departure for Australia. She had booked her flight, prepared her visa documents, and even chosen the small apartment she would live in overseas. She told her friends during one last dinner, "When I land in Sydney, I'll finally be free." Those would become her final words to them. Then came the night of July 1st, at 1:47 a.m. Security camera footage captured Kim entering the apartment building. He used a back entrance, seemingly familiar with the layout. At 2:13 a.m., the same camera recorded a shadow falling from the 14th floor. Ming Jiang, her lifeless body, was found moments later. But what truly horrified investigators was what they found inside the apartment. Overturned furniture, broken glass, a phone with its screen shattered, and evidence of a violent struggle. The 10-minute gap between her fall and Kim's emergency call became the central mystery. During those minutes, Kim deleted several messages from his phone. Forensic recovery later revealed that he had sent 2 alarming texts just before the fall. "If you leave me, we both die. You think you can start a new life without me? Never." When confronted with this evidence, Kim broke down in tears, insisting it was an accident, that he was trying to stop Ming Jiang from jumping. However, the bruises on her wrists told a different story. The autopsy revealed signs of struggle, and investigators concluded that she had been forcefully held near the window before falling. In August 2024, Kim Do-eun was officially charged with murder and obstruction of justice. The case ignited massive public outrage in South Korea, especially among women's rights groups, who condemned the repeated failures of authorities to protect Ming Jiang, despite multiple reports and warnings. Vigils were held nationwide under the slogan, "Justice for Ming Jiang." During the first trial session, Kim maintained his innocence, saying tearfully, "I loved her too much. I never meant for her to die." But the prosecutor's closing statement cut through the courtroom silence. Love does not monitor, isolate, or destroy. What Kim Do-eun called love was control, and control turned to violence, until it claimed a young woman's life. The verdict is still pending, but whatever the outcome, the tragedy of Lee Ming Jiang stands as a haunting reminder of how unchecked obsession, ignored warnings, and systemic inaction can end a life full of dreams. Min Young's family found this indifference unbearable, while they were crushed by loss and struggling to understand how such injustice could occur. Kim's sister, a well-known actress, continued to appear on television, smiling as if nothing had happened. Her ongoing success in the entertainment industry felt like a cruel insult to the memory of their daughter. For Min Young's aunt, this was the final straw. Fueled by pain and anger, she decided that silence would no longer be an option. Her heartfelt post on the forum quickly went viral, sparking nationwide outrage. Thousands of users flooded the comment sections with demands for accountability and justice. Hashtags like #Justice for Min Jiang and #StopDatingViolence began trending across Korean social media platforms. The post painted a chilling picture of the emotional and physical abuse Min Young had endured, messages filled with degradation, late-night threats, and proof of Kim's repeated stalking. It also exposed how every attempt she made to seek help was dismissed or ignored by authorities. The story resonated deeply with countless women who had experienced similar situations, but never saw justice served. Within days, major media outlets picked up the case, forcing the police to respond publicly. Under growing public pressure, officials were compelled to reopen the investigation. This time, forensic experts re-examined the evidence, including phone records, message histories, and building security footage. What they found supported the family's long-standing belief. Min Young's death could not have been an accident. The re-investigation revealed new details that had been overlooked or ignored in the initial inquiry. The scratches on Kim's arm, the bruises on Min Young's wrists, and the missing fragments of glass from the apartment window all suggested a violent struggle had taken place, combined with the threatening text messages Kim sent just before the fall. Investigators began to see a clear pattern of coercive control escalating into lethal violence. The new findings reignited nationwide debate about South Korea's handling of domestic abuse and stalking cases. Critics accused the justice system of protecting perpetrators with social influence or family connections, while failing to protect vulnerable victims. Activists demanded reforms, stronger protection laws, and harsher penalties for offenders. For Min Yang's family, the renewed investigation was both painful and hopeful, a chance to finally uncover the truth behind their daughter's tragic death. As her aunt said during an emotional interview, "We can't bring Min Yang back, but if her story can change even one law, save even one woman's life, then she will not have died in vain." The police arrived at the scene after a violent argument. Both parties had already calmed down, and Ming Jiang once again declined to press charges. The third time, the officers said they advised her to apply for a restraining order, but noted that she appeared hesitant, saying she didn't want to ruin his life, according to the authorities. These statements limited the scope of their legal intervention. However, this explanation did little to calm public outrage. Critics argued that the police had completely failed to assess the pattern of escalating abuse, focusing only on isolated incidents instead of the broader context of ongoing coercive control. Feminist groups and human rights advocates accused law enforcement of passivity and negligence, pointing out that their rigid procedures effectively left victims, like Ming Jiang, unprotected until it was too late. Several legal experts interviewed on the same television program echoed this sentiment. They noted that South Korea's existing anti-stalking laws, passed in 2021, still contained many loopholes that allowed offenders to escape severe punishment. Most stalking-related offenses were categorized as misdemeanors, unless accompanied by direct physical injury, a legal gap that had proven deadly in multiple cases. By the time the system acts, one legal analyst said, it often acts too late. The broadcast drew unprecedented attention. Within hours, the segment became one of the most discussed topics online. Thousands of social media users expressed fury over how repeated warnings and cries for help had been ignored. Many compared Ming Jiang's story to previous high-profile cases in Korea, where women were killed after authorities failed to intervene despite multiple reports. Under mounting public pressure, lawmakers announced an emergency review of the Domestic Violence and Stalking Prevention Act, promising stronger protective measures for victims and harsher penalties for repeat offenders. The Ministry of Justice vowed to consider reforms that would allow police to act proactively even if victims were hesitant to press charges, especially in cases showing clear signs of coercive control and repeated harassment. For Ming Jiang's parents, these developments came as bittersweet relief. On one hand, they finally saw society beginning to acknowledge the injustice their daughter suffered. On the other, no reform or public apology could ever bring her back. In a press conference, her mother tearfully said, "My daughter begged for help. She did everything she could, but the people who should have protected her chose silence. Now that she's gone, the world suddenly listens." The heartbreaking words struck a chord across the nation, becoming a rallying cry for women's safety advocates. Candlelight vigils were held in Busan, Seoul, and Daegu, where people placed white flowers beneath posters of Ming Jiang's smiling face, the same smile she had during her last phone call with her aunt, when she believed she was finally free. He claimed that his client's silence was not out of arrogance or lack of remorse, but fear of worsening the situation. However, this explanation only fueled more outrage. Too many observers. It seemed like yet another attempt to distort the narrative and portray the perpetrator as a victim of circumstance. As the trial progressed, prosecutors dismantled the defense's arguments point by point. They presented digital evidence showing a pattern of obsessive control, hundreds of calls and messages sent by Kim even after the breakup, GPS tracking installed on Ming Jiang's car, and surveillance camera footage confirming he had approached her apartment without permission on multiple occasions. Furthermore, neighbors testified hearing loud arguments and cries from Ming Jiang's unit just days before her death. A key moment in the trial came when forensic analysts revealed chilling details from the night of the tragedy. Security camera footage from the apartment building showed Kim entering through the back entrance at 1:46 a.m., wearing gloves and a dark hoodie. About 15 minutes later, a loud noise was recorded, followed by complete silence. The next morning, Ming Jiang was found lifeless in her apartment, and Kim had disappeared. Prosecutors used this evidence to assert that his actions were not impulsive but premeditated, a planned escalation of months of stalking and psychological torment. The courtroom fell silent as prosecutors displayed text messages Ming Jiang had sent to a friend shortly before her death. "He won't stop," she had written. "Even when I change my number, he finds a way. I'm scared he'll come for me." Those final words echoed through the chamber, a haunting reminder of the fear she had lived under and the system that had failed her. Public sentiment outside the courtroom was overwhelmingly unforgiving. Candlelight vigils were held across Busan and Seoul, demanding justice not only for Ming Jiang, but for all victims of stalking and domestic violence ignored by authorities. The case sparked nationwide debate, prompting calls for amendments to South Korea's Anti-Stalking Act to allow police to intervene earlier and impose protective orders without victim consent when there's clear evidence of danger. When the verdict was finally announced, the judge acknowledged that while the defense claimed lack of direct intent, the overwhelming evidence showed sustained harassment that directly led to the victim's death. Kim was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 9 years in prison, 1 year less than the prosecution's recommendation. The court stated that the sentence took into account both his repeated offenses and his failure to show genuine remorse. Even so, Ming Jiang's family expressed disappointment. Her aunt tearfully said outside the courthouse, 9 years is not justice. He stole a life, and after 9 years, he will walk free. The case left a deep mark on South Korean society, not only as a personal tragedy, but as a symbol of institutional inertia. Legal experts continued to argue that the tragedy could have been prevented if police had exercised stronger initiative, especially given Kim's documented history of violence in the months that followed. The government introduced new legislative proposals strengthening protection for stalking victims. Under the proposed reforms, restraining orders could be issued without the victim's consent if evidence suggests a credible threat. The story of Ming Jiang became a catalyst for change, her death no longer just a case in a courtroom, but a wake-up call that forced a nation to confront its failure to protect the vulnerable. Public attention to the case didn't fade even after the sentencing. Instead, it ignited a broader social movement that refused to let Ming Jiang's story become another forgotten tragedy. Online communities, women's rights organizations, and university student groups began organizing nationwide campaigns under the slogan, #Justice for Ming Jiang. Protesters gathered outside the National Assembly building in Seoul, carrying placards that read "Fear is not consent, and the system failed her." Within weeks, petitions demanding stricter stalking laws accumulated over 1 million signatures. Lawmakers who had long avoided the controversial debate over privacy versus public safety were suddenly forced to take a stand. The Minister of Justice publicly acknowledged that the Ming Jiang case exposed dangerous gaps in how our system handles stalking and intimate partner violence. Television networks and newspapers continued to investigate Kim's past, uncovering further disturbing details that deepened public outrage. Former acquaintances described him as manipulative, short-tempered, and obsessed with control, One ex-colleague from his workplace even admitted, "We all knew he had a violent side." He bragged about keeping tabs on his girlfriends. Despite this, Kim had never been listed as a repeat offender in the national database because his previous offenses resulted only in fines. Legal scholars called for systemic reform. Professor Han Ji-won, a leading expert on criminal psychology at Yonsei University, published a widely discussed editorial titled, "Fear Cannot Be a Barrier to Justice." In it, she wrote, "The law should not depend on whether a terrified victim continues to cooperate. When patterns of coercion and control are evident, the state must act independently. Fear silences victims, and silence should never be mistaken for consent." By late 2024, several key policy changes had already begun taking shape. The Ministry of Gender Equality and Family established a new rapid response unit for stalking cases, equipped with authority to issue emergency restraining orders within 24 hours. The National Police Agency introduced mandatory training programs for officers on identifying early signs of coercive control and digital surveillance, an area previously overlooked, despite its growing presence in modern relationships. Meanwhile, in Busan, a small memorial garden was built near Ming Jiang's former apartment complex. It became a quiet space where people could leave flowers, notes, and candles. Each week, strangers came, some survivors of abuse themselves, to pay their respects. One message, written on a folded piece of paper, read, "You didn't die in vain. Your story changed the law, and it will save others." When the appellate court later reviewed Kim's case in early 2025, prosecutors pushed for a harsher sentence, arguing that the original 9-year term was disproportionate to the severity of his crimes. The appeals panel, however, upheld the initial verdict, stating that while the moral culpability was grave, the existing legal framework still limited how far sentencing could go in cases where direct causation of death was not definitively proven. That statement, legal framework limitations, became another flashpoint for reform activists. Many argued that such legal rigidity continued to protect offenders more than victims. A national task force was soon created to re-evaluate the Anti-Stalking Act, aiming to redefine causation in cases involving psychological coercion, leading to death or suicide. As of late 2025, the movement that began with one woman's silent suffering had reshaped an entire nation's understanding of domestic abuse. Ming Jiang's name appeared in textbooks, legal seminars, and public safety campaigns. Her story became a case study taught in law schools, symbolizing both tragedy and transformation, a painful reminder that justice delayed is justice denied, and that silence, once broken, can change everything. However, according to the lawyer, Kim and his father had sent apology letters through Ming Jiang's family lawyer, an indirect form of apology that, in their view, demonstrated remorse under public pressure. The defense used this as grounds to request a reduced sentence. Kim himself stated that for the rest of his life, he would reflect and remember all those who had suffered because of him. Notably, he sent his deepest condolences to Ming Jiang's case but still stopped short of a direct apology, instead bowing to the judge. The court found Kim's attitude troubling. The presiding judge emphasized that, in today's society, where violence within romantic relationships is increasingly condemned, issuing a strong warning through punishment was a social necessity. Regarding the defense's argument that Ming Jiang hadn't clearly refused contact, the judge criticized this logic. It was evident, he said, that Ming Jiang did not want Kim's continuous interference. Her kind and communicative nature merely caused her to respond in ways that could be misread. Still, the judge admitted that, despite ongoing suspicions and a wide-reaching investigation, proving a direct connection between Kim's actions and Ming Jiang's death was legally difficult, considering Kim's payment of $30,122,500 in bail and his position as a recent university graduate entering society. The court chose to balance punishment with the principles of rehabilitation. After 2 months of tense hearings, the verdict was announced on a humid summer day in 2024. Kim was sentenced to 3 years and 6 months in prison and ordered to complete 40 hours of psychological treatment. Yet the decision satisfied no one. Mingjang's family expressed deep disappointment, saying the court had failed to recognize the true severity of violence disguised as love. Prosecutors echoed this sentiment, claiming the punishment lacked deterrent value and risked allowing similar tragedies to repeat. Public opinion was sharply divided, but most agreed justice had not been done. Shockingly, even Kim appealed the verdict, calling it too harsh. 4 months later, in November 2024, the appellate hearing opened once more at Busan District Court. This time, the panel noted Kim's new gestures. He had submitted compensation for the victim's family and written a direct apology. The judge considered these as evidence of repentance and reduced the sentence by 4 months. Kim's final sentence stood at 3 years and 2 months. For Mingjang's family, the reduction felt like a cruel joke, another wound on top of their grief. To them, justice seemed to slip further away, washed out by legal formalities and the weight of societal indifference. As the rain gently falls and the night grows deeper, thank you for joining me here at Crime Whisper. True crime stories remind us of life's darkest corners and the fragile light that tries to escape them. May tonight's whispers remind you to stay aware, to stay safe, and to never let silence bury the truth. Until we meet again, let the night watch over you.